On behalf of the New Europe Center, I would like to welcome you today for the discussion on the peacekeeping mission, which is called "What kind of peacekeeping mission Ukraine needs?" We have a distinguished panel today of people who could professionally discuss this issue. Before getting on the discussion itself, I'd like to underline that today's discussion is going to take place in two languages, so English and Ukrainian. Make sure you have headphones if you need them. I would like to underline as well, before we start the discussion, that New Europe Center is a think tank which has been interested in this issue since 2014. And what we did before is the report which was commissioned by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the comparative analysis of conflicts around the world and how we can take some lessons learned, let's say, from other conflicts and apply them in Ukraine in order to make the settlement more faster or more possible. And we also initiated the statement on red lines in the settlement of the conflict in the east of Ukraine. Heading to the directly to the question of today's discussion, I would like to remind that the short chronology of this issue is that it was President Poroshenko first to propose such an idea of having a peacekeeping mission. This was, I mean, as far as I know, Ukraine wanted a peacekeeping mission maybe with the participation of EU or OSCE, but it was impossible this to take place. So then it was discussed about UN mission, which was not, as far as I remember, very much welcomed by the Obama administration at that time. However, with the Trump administration, there was a new window of opportunity to discuss such a mission, and not a UN mission, but a UN mandated mission. And after the first, basically after the first meeting of Kurt Volker and Surkov, Putin was the one who announced that Russia is ready to discuss a possible mission, a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine. And that was, of course, from one side encouraging, because also some of our international partners got interested. But as usual, the devil is in the details, because the peacekeeping mission which was proposed by Russian president was rather an OSCE escort mission than the idea which Ukraine had in mind when discussed this mission. So I would like, with this introduction, I would like to present the panel and to give the floor to the speakers to present their thoughts on this. So we have Mr. Richard Gowan, who came here for study visit, 2-day study visit, which is taking place with the New Europe Center and German Marshall Fund. So Mr. Gowan is senior fellow at the UN University Center for Policy Research and is associated also with the European Council on Foreign Relations. And he is also the author of the report, Can the United Nations Unite Ukraine?, which was prepared for the Hudson Institute and was at the basis of the discussion on peacekeeping mission. We have also Robert Serry, a diplomat, former United Nations Special Coordinator for Middle East, and who published a report just 1 day ago, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, 1 day ago, which is here we have the report. You maybe had the occasion to get it at the entrance. Blue helmets in Donbas. A phased and sequenced scenario to unlock the Minsk agreements and restore peace in Ukraine. So I encourage to read both reports of Mr. Gowan and Mr. Serry. And we have, of course, Mr. Alexander Mocek, who is ambassador in the United States of Ukraine, ambassador in Poland, ambassador in Turkey, and currently is the Ukraine representative to the political subgroup of the Minsk Trilateral Contact Group. Having said this, I would like to ask our speakers to present maybe the key findings of their reports, and then Mr. Mocek to present his vision, his opinions, and then we can have a discussion, a Q&A session about this, the issues which would be raised. Mr. Gowan, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the New Europe Centre for inviting me here today. I feel a little deficient as I am the only person on the panel who is not an ambassador. But please forgive me, I can dream one day. One day I too will be an ambassador. Leo, your setting out of the chronology is helpful because I should say that I began work on my paper for the Hudson Institute in October, November 2017. And the paper was written in a moment of optimism about the possibility of peacekeeping in the Donbas, resulting from President Putin's rather enigmatic suggestion that he might be open to a UN force. In that period, I was hearing a lot of proposals for peacekeeping operations that I thought were unrealistic. I have worked on peacekeeping for about 15 years in cases from Kosovo to Haiti, and I therefore have some broad idea of how peace operations work. And it seemed to me that there were two sets of ideas a year ago that were not realistic. One was the Putin plan. I saw no value in putting UN personnel on the ground to protect the current OSCE mission. And the OSCE sees no value in that either. I thought that minimal option was not worthwhile. Equally, I felt that there were proposals for a peace enforcement operation in the Donbas of 50 to 60,000 troops, similar to the NATO force in Kosovo, that were simply not realistic and probably actively dangerous. The idea that you would have a large-scale NATO-style force going into the Donbas struck me as a dream, and it was not clear to me how you could find any countries to supply the troops for such a dangerous mission. And so the question that I asked in my paper, and which Robert also asks in his excellent new report, is there a middle ground? Is there a peacekeeping option which could actually work and which would be acceptable both to Kiev but also to Moscow? And this was my focus. What are the key findings? I mean, look, the most important finding, and we have to say this at the beginning, is that a peacekeeping operation in itself is not an answer to the problem of the Donbas. The answer to the problem of the Donbas is some form of strategic compromise between Russia and Ukraine's Western allies, on withdrawing Russian forces from the region and allowing the reintegration of the region into Ukraine. That is a political decision which Russia has to make. And how Russia gets to that decision is something that I think we're all still struggling with. Only if you have that compromise is a peacekeeping operation even feasible. What would a peacekeeping operation do if Russia was willing to withdraw from the Donbas? I think there are three important functions. Firstly, a force of approximately 20,000 peacekeepers could help ensure a stable and secure environment following the Russian withdrawal and the withdrawal of Russia's proxies. There is a risk of a security vacuum. International forces could fill that vacuum and ensure that you do not have a new upsurge of violence in the region. Secondly, the force could enable local elections in the Donbas in line with the Minsk II agreement. And thirdly, the military force, as I say, a military force of about 20,000, assisted by police, could provide a framework for the civilian dimensions of reintegration. And this is something, Robert, that you may say more about because you emphasize it in your paper. The reintegration process in the Donbas would not be solely a security issue. It would have many social and economic functions. and a UN force or a UN mandated force could provide the overarching framework for that. Specifically on the security issue, I suggest that a peacekeeping force would have to do three things. Firstly, it would need to go to the Russian border, and it would need to reassure the Ukrainian authorities by maintaining an international presence, at least eventually on the international border, as a tripwire, if you will, or a reassurance mechanism against further Russian interventions across the border. Secondly, the peacekeepers might have to canton remaining heavy weaponry and militia groups in the region. And thirdly, I think we could expect peacekeepers to use limited force to deal with spoiler groups that wish to spark new violence. But only limited force. We're not talking about a NATO-style counterinsurgency operation. We're talking about limited military operations to deal with small upsurges in violence that could otherwise escalate out of control. So that's what I conceive the peace operation doing. Let me make 3 quick points before I hand over to Robert. Firstly, my report focused very heavily on what the UN force or a UN mandated force could do. Some people thought that this meant that I felt the OSCE presence in Ukraine should end. That was absolutely not my intention. I think it is very important to say that the OSCE mission here is currently the best that we've got. We should not undermine that. And that even if you were to have a UN peacekeeping operation, I would foresee a large scale, perhaps a growing role for the OSCE in dealing with social and political issues in the Donbas. Secondly, some people thought that the report suggested that you should have a full-scale Kosovo-style international administration in the Donbas. I'm skeptical about that. I think that there are many elements of governance that the Ukrainian authorities could take over almost immediately in a reintegration process, but possibly with some form of international assistance and oversight. But Robert, I think you say more about this, so I will leave that to you. Thirdly, there is one very tricky question that faces anyone writing about peacekeeping in Donbas, and that is, who will the peacekeepers be? And my suggestion of a force of 20,000, it's easier than finding 50,000 troops, but it's still actually quite hard to work out where you would get the 20,000 personnel from. I think that it is probable that the lead of such a force would have to come from non-NATO European countries, such as Sweden and Finland. And the Swedes and the Finns, although cautious, have suggested they would be interested in such a role. A UN force could also bring together a variety of peacekeepers from countries with strong experience in blue helmet missions, such as the Latin American countries. Brazilian peacekeepers are excellent. I've seen them at work in Haiti. Or even Mongolia, which has actually got a very, very good record of peacekeeping and has been well trained by the US. One controversial suggestion I made in the report was that it might be necessary to include CSTO countries, such as Kazakhstan, in the force. And I can see there are huge amounts of political sensitivities around that. Nonetheless, my argument in the report was that by introducing some CSTO countries, it might be possible to get leverage and space to bring in some NATO countries too. Perhaps Spain, perhaps Italy. And you might end up with a force that was balanced between countries closer to the West, members of the West, and countries closer to Moscow, in what would be a very, very tricky compromise. But as I say, all peacekeeping is about compromise, and that's what we're trying to facilitate here.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Yes, please do. It has been a bit of a race against time, actually, to publish this report for this meeting, but with Richard in town, I couldn't think of a better moment to come out with this report. I wish to thank our partner, the International Renaissance Foundation here in Ukraine, for making that happen, and let me thank you, Leo, also for making this happen. I'm very happy to participate in this and to tell you a bit more about this new report. Richard, you said that you wrote that report, and when it was published, it was a moment of hope after the opening that was given by Putin, although that proved to be a limited one. That maybe this was the way to go ahead. I think we are now maybe in a moment of realism. I'm not publishing this report with the expectation that what we are advising here is going to be immediately implemented. Ukraine itself is going into an election cycle, and there are more reasons for me to be cautious about the prospects that actually the conditions this report is also talking about will materialize anytime soon. And when it comes to the conditions, let me echo and reinforce what Richard has already said, that without an understanding at the highest level between Russia and Ukraine about what is to happen, and that also backed up by the international community, I would not be advising any UN role complementary to the OSCE, because here again I wish to echo what Richard has already been telling you. Also, this report isn't talking about the UN taking over. No, it's talking about a combined OSCE-UN mission to unlock the Minsk agreements. Now, maybe why are we considering it so important that there is this renewed understanding at the highest level? That has, in my view, a lot to do with the character of the Minsk agreements. You will find in this report a chapter devoted to the Minsk agreements. And you know there is not one agreement, there are three. And if you analyze them, you do find all the issues that need to be addressed in a peace process that could lead to the full implementation of Minsk. But there is very little structure in it. There's very little ordering in it. And that brings me again to my second message, which you find also in the title. When I talk about a renewed understanding, it means it will have to be about a phased and sequenced scenario to unlock the Minsk agreements and restore peace in Ukraine. Why am I saying this? Because if you look at the Minsk agreements at present, the parties have widely different views on what needs to happen first, and then second, and then third. It explains, I think, Ambassador, you might wish to say something more about that, because you are actually also part of the Minsk process. So what we have done, actually, in this report is actually we have tried to take the argument which was already put forward to you eloquently in the report of Richard a bit further. We, in this report, have tried to imagine a scenario how actually, in earnest, a peacekeeping operation, a combined peacekeeping operation of the OSCE and the UN could take place. And what we have been actually been discussing with our interlocutors also here in Ukraine is in a three-phased approach preceded with a very important zero phase. Before I come to that, let me also tell you one thing. This is not my report only. I came here together with three other seasoned Dutch practitioners in crisis management. The first one was Bert Koenders, a former foreign minister of the Netherlands, but also a former UN envoy, for instance, in Mali. He has been in particular in Africa for the UN. And Peter Veit may also be known to you. Peter Veit is in particular has been for the EU the one heading the EU operation in Kosovo. He has also been with NATO, so he has in particular a lot of experience with NATO and the EU. And for myself, I bring in particular also experience with NATO first, and then later also with the UN. So see this as our advice to you. We talked with Ukrainian stakeholders, NGOs, think tanks, and they know that we were also about to publish a report, but it was done in quiet. So I'm not going to disclose in particular with whom we have been talking. I don't have the liberty to do so. I leave that up to them. Now back to the report. So I said what we have tried to imagine is actually, well, let's try to imagine how it actually could happen. And there again, I come to a very important notion already also touched upon by Richard. This is not a report about some sort of limited implementation of Minsk. This is a report where we actually have tried to think it through how Minsk can be implemented in full. So not only an operation limited to the contact line, which was the original Russian proposal. By the way, there are also Russian studies mentioned in this report which acknowledge that that is not enough, and that we need a phased and sequenced approach to fully implement the Minsk agreements. So maybe that is a little reason for hope that the parties can actually agree about something like that in the future. Now, as I already said, we don't only talk about a three-phased approach, but also about a zero phase. And why are we saying that this zero phase is so important? We, like Richard, do not believe that you should not think that the UN can come in and enforce the peace. At the moment, we're talking about a very hot conflict. I'm very sad to say this. For me, this is Europe's forgotten war. And if this report can also help to actually highlight that there are daily still sacrifices and people dying, then I'm already happy about that. So this is a hot conflict, and so there is no real ceasefire on the ground at the moment. And we do not believe that a UN force could come in and enforce that peace. So as part of that renewed understanding at the highest level, there has to be a renewed commitment to start implementing the paragraphs pertaining in the Minsk Accords to the ceasefire. There has to be a calm of at least 2 to 4 months on the ground. Apart from that, parties need to recommit also themselves to the Minsk agreements in an understanding, as I have already indicated, about what goes first and what then. The sequenced and approach which I have mentioned already. But that zero phase, which we think could lead to up to 2 to 4 months, could be used for the UN to pre-deploy already forces in the host country, Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine will have to give permission for any operation, and Russia will have to also accept it. That's very clear, and that is also something which is sine qua non for anything to happen here. Now, then, what we have then tried to chart out, and again, I'm not saying that this should be done exactly according to our scenario. It is just a first attempt to imagine how it could happen. We have distinguished 3 phases for this operation then to unfold. Once the minimum conditions on the ground exist to actually deploy. It is we call it first the phase of hard security, then broad security, and then it is actually peace consolidation, where actually the free and fair conditions for elections have been established. And as you know, elections will then finally fully unlock the Minsk agreements by reassertion of Ukraine over its own external border with Russia in the conflict zone. Now, so three phases. I will not go too much in detail because I think it's better for you to read the report in full. But like Richard, we have been looking also for more realistic ways for involvement of the UN, not with a large force. So again, very important that zero phase, because if the parties are behaving, then you don't need a massive force actually to enforce the peace first on the ground. There will be, in our view, a need for a small force in the beginning, in particular using intelligence. It should have air control over the air. That is very important also. By the way, there are provisions in the Minsk agreements about that. And actually, that force should then, first of all, strengthen the ceasefire already existing on the ground, but at the same time start to deploy all over the conflict zone up till the border with Russia, where also then a monitoring regime should be established by the OSCE monitors, supported by that force. So that is basically what needs to happen in phase 1. And what we expect Russia to have done, and this is a very important benchmark for phase 1, is that actually Article 10 of the package of measures about the full withdrawal of foreign forces and mercenaries in this phase, which could lead, again, and everything is indicative, only indications in this report, could maybe take some 4 to 6 months. But in those 4 to 6 months, we expect all foreign forces to have left the conflict zone. That is a very important benchmark for the first phase. Before you can continue into the second phase, which we call the broad security phase, where all the other things need to happen, mentioned in the also still security related in the Minsk agreements, which is the amnesty, and associated with the amnesty, the disarmament, but not only disarmament, DDR in full. We'll have to also the reintegration of militias, which will be disarmed, is a part of that second phase. We believe that in that stage, indeed, an interim civilian administration is needed. But like Richard, we do not propose a Kosovo type of civil administration. We want Ukraine from the beginning to take an active part in actually the phase where the situation has to be prepared for free and fair elections in the conflict zone. So this is very important also for you to understand that Ukraine will have to show also its part and willingness to play its part. I want to say this in all frankness to you. We have been also very frank with all our interlocutors during our meetings here in Kiev. We welcome, by the way, that the special law has been recently prolonged by the Rada until the end of next year. I think that is very important, because the special law goes a long way in terms of Ukraine's commitments under the Minsk agreements to provide for self-government and also for the other things like the reconstruction of that area. Here again, Ukraine will have to win back the hearts and minds of the people over there. That's why we have been proposing early confidence-building measures also, for instance, about once the force comes in, to have actually also banking system restored. There will be safe areas can be created for that also once a force is deployed in the conflict zones. These are very important things for you to realize that this is all important. I do not believe that this problem is, I see that you are already looking a bit, I'm not been saying here that I believe that this is a problem that is so difficult that it cannot be resolved. On the contrary, I believe that once there is this agreement on the highest level, that it will be possible. But with every day passing, a contact line becomes also more a reality. People are suffering on both sides, there is hatred on both sides, and it should not be underestimated. That's why I think that we do not have the luxury of much time. Maybe nothing is going to happen anytime soon, but if this report can actually help to keep it alive, and for you to have an informed discussion about what needs to be done, then we, as the authors of the report, would already be very satisfied. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation of report and for these ideas, basically, and for underlining also the role of the Minsk agreements. I mean, many diplomats in Ukraine today say that Minsk agreements are like Lenin, dead but not buried. I think that this is not the case, because, I mean, this report shows the link, and I think we have one of the best person to reflect on this from the side of Ukrainian government. So, Mr. Motzik, I pass to you straight.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to express my deep gratitude to Ambassador Serry for preparation and presentation of this report. I had not maybe very much time, but I looked through the report and found it quite professional, comprehensive, deep and detailed. And I think that when times come, Ukraine will use at least some of elements of this report in practical measures to connect it with the deployment of peacekeeping operation and in settlement in the eastern part of Ukraine in general. I also would like to thank to Mr. Gowan for his contribution, hope future ambassador, political appointee, and to Mr. Litra as moderator as well. At this stage, I would like to switch to Ukrainian, if you don't mind.
please,
Yeah,
Ukrainian,
yeah,
English.
yeah. Thank you.
A brief pause, a brief interval for you to put on your headsets. I just returned from Minsk. Practically, I left the train and went to my home for a few minutes, and then I arrived to this venue, and it was the 97th round of negotiations there in peace. So I can assure you that this process, the Minsk process, is alive. And the situation in these negotiations is close to a deadlock, which the reason for which, as I see it, is the position of the Russian Federation. And Russia is playing its strategic game, and it's reluctant to follow some full-scale process of peaceful settlement of this situation. It's rather willing to freeze this situation as it is. Therefore, I would like to say that at this last meeting, we couldn't manage, we couldn't convince the Russian Federation to cancel the elections that they are planning for November the 10th, I think, of this year. We emphasized that the European Union was against that, these elections. The United States were against these elections. But as we saw it at that meeting, Russia was resolute in holding these elections at that date. Therefore, Russia practically follows its own course without following exactly the Minsk agreements path delineated by, outlined by the Minsk agreements. At the meeting before that, where there had been a meeting of the diplomatic counselors from 4 countries of the Minsk process, the agreement was reached, had been reached to hold a summit before the end of this year. Getting back to this issue of the peacekeeping mission in Ukraine, it is needed, but it is not needed in the form and shape proposed by the Russian Federation, which was to put the peacekeepers along the so-called contact line, that that personnel protect only the SMM's personnel or functionaries. In our view, it would just freeze the whole conflict situation for years and years to come. And our view, our vision of a peacekeeping operation is that the peacekeepers should be deployed all over the territory that we consider to be occupied, and all the main points should be included among these locations where they are deployed, and they should be granted the right of immediate access to any area. And what is also important is that along the Russian-Ukraine border, they are also deployed along the sections of the border that are not under control of Ukrainian authorities, but are controlled by the self-proclaimed pro-Russian republics and militias, and that through which the Russian side infiltrate into Ukraine its mercenaries, its personnel, paramilitary personnel. But as of today, Russia is reluctant to discuss the issue of the borderline as such, and I've been for the last half a year being a specialist on the political issues, have been participating in these discussions, but the Russian side's position has been all that time that Ukraine is not to be granted control of that portion of the borderline. Russia does not want it to happen. And the Russian side, including Mr. Putin, are of the view that Russia does not even touch upon this issue, which in turn makes it quite important to us. And we need to have better understanding of what's going to happen at the end of the day, so to say. What are going to be the outcomes of this negotiating process in terms of the regaining of control. And another issue is the mandate of this mission, and it is mentioned in the report. And there should be a decision of the Security Council of the United Nations for that. And we hope that Germany and France, as the Norman 4 members, would facilitate all the efforts aimed at peaceful settlement in the Donbas. As far as the PKO itself is concerned, Ukraine's position is that not less than 20,000 peacekeepers and maybe 5,000 more policemen are deployed or be deployed, and that would be the personnel that would enable these conditions, make possible these conditions conducive to the local elections. At least that's what we are going to discuss with our counterparts. And as Kosovo was mentioned, we hope that we would not need that many peacekeepers. If I'm not mistaken, there were in excess of 50,000 people deployed in Kosovo. I hope that we will that smaller numbers would do in our situation, but the importance that was already mentioned also of the aerial surveillance. And so these are the components on which we count for this mission, for such a mission, should it be deployed, be sufficient, be efficient also. We also need to understand that when we speak about the personnel for this mission, for such a peacekeeping mission, the reluctance of many countries should be taken into account to deploy their personnel into highly dangerous environment, highly dangerous situation. But if we speak about our vision of the Ukrainian side's vision, we understand that this mission should be somehow balanced by both sides. It's not only the Ukrainian side's matter, it's also Russian Federation should also be involved in, discussing these issues and guaranteeing. And among the countries that have already been mentioned that could potentially deploy their personnel, Sweden was already mentioned, Austria possibly, Belarus and Kazakhstan, if they can be deployed there. Let's take into consideration the fact that Belarus is a member of the so-called unified country with the Russian Federation. And Kazakhstan is also a member of a political bloc, a political formation that probably is practically entirely in favor of Russia and holds pro-Russian positions on the majority of international issues. We can review the positions of the other neighboring countries like Baltic states, for example, Poland, the other neighboring countries to Ukraine. They understand the psychology of the Ukrainians, of the Russians, and their participation would be, might be useful. So this is our vision as of today, the vision of we have here in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian government, with regard to potential peacekeeping operation in the Donbas. If we manage to reach agreement on it, it's a big, there is a big doubt about that, but let me state our position that we consider it necessary and a strong, it could provide a strong impetus to the implementation of the Minsk process, and as we can see, peaceful settlement in Donbas has not yet reached the results that are desirable to the Ukrainian side, and for example, the losses among the Ukrainian military continue. For example, yesterday, one more person was perished, and I recently had a meeting with a man who took part in fighting for the airport at Donetsk, and he told me about all the difficulties, all the ordeals that he had come through. So our final goal, let it be clear, for Ukraine, its final goal is to achieve reintegration of these territories again into Ukraine, and territorial integrity of Ukraine should be renewed 100%, and rehabilitation, reintegration, renovation of, or rather restoration of infrastructure. And it is important to win back the hearts and minds of the people of the Donbas. That is also an important factor.
The issue of peacekeeping mission, I would like to open the floor for questions and comments. Before giving this opportunity, I'd like to remind that the questions should be addressed on the today's discussed issue, peacekeeping mission. And please introduce yourself and state your question or comment. So I see first hand there, please, and then here.
Дозвольте мені говорити українською, я говорю українською швидше, ніж англійською.
Allow me to speak Ukrainian as I speak Ukrainian quicker than English. I represent the Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, and I'm in charge of a group that is in charge of the review of this possibility, of this option of a peacekeeping mission in the Donbas. So first, my commentary, and then I would be interested to hear your view. First of all, we discuss the number of peacekeepers, for example, the other security issues, and we discuss the overall scenario, the willingness or unwillingness of the Russian side. My view, and I would like to express it now, my view is that Ukraine, together with a number of other countries, is going to address the Security Council of the United Nations, and I hope that Germany's chairmanship that starts in January is being expected, or they are waiting simply for until Germany becomes a chairman in January. If we have at least a recommendation from the General Assembly, and at least the agreement, some agreement from the Russian Federation, then the passing of that issue from the General Assembly into the Security Council would be more logical because the Security Council would review both proposals from Ukraine and from Russia. And Ukrainian proposal, Ukrainian. The formula of the peacekeepers standing along or being deployed on both sides of the so-called contact line is a traditional deployment, way of deploying peacekeeping operations. And if this form is adopted, then this conflict is viewed as Ukraine's own domestic conflict, internal conflict. It could happen so that in the Security Council neither of the proposals would be accepted, would be endorsed, because we know how the Security Council works. And there could be something like of a commission set up by the Security Council for reaching the agreement. And what is interesting is what mechanisms the United Nations are going to be used. Would this process of the review of the Russian and Ukrainian proposals be done under the auspices of the Secretary General, or what body of the United Nations? And if Security Council be inefficient, then we can use maybe some other mechanism. Like, for example, there have been already some precedents in the United Nations where this Security Council's decision could be somehow circumvented, at least to put some pressure on Russia. That's my remark. That's my understanding.
Gentleman asking the question said about the possible proposal of Ukraine with some other countries to the UN, and a lot of questions are raised by people here, by diplomats also, if it's possible to have any kind of progress before elections in Ukraine, because there is a widespread feeling that no progress should be expected before elections. While I'd like to maybe to know your opinion on this, if you would expect, and what would be the conditions allowing for any progress before elections. So I think we answer this question and we take another round then, because the question was very, very big with many components. So please. Who would like to start? You want me to go?
Yes, well, of course, we all understand that this needs a decision in the United Nations itself. We already also, both of us, made it very clear that it is not only the UN which is going to be involved, but the OSCE as well. For instance, in our report, we therefore suggest that the Secretary General should actually, both Secretary Generals then of the OSCE and the United Nations should actually nominate a double-headed special representative once there is an agreement on a peacekeeping operation, on a peace support operation, just to underscore the importance of the cooperation between these two bodies. Now, on your question well, first of all, when it comes to the election period, doesn't seem to be very likely, I think. But if there would be, at the same time, some possibility for moving forward, for instance, during the German presidency, as you suggested in January, then that would be always welcome. I would like to caution you on a Ukrainian initiative, as I understood it, in the General Assembly, which would then probably be brought to the Security Council in order to circumvent the Security Council because of a Russian veto. This is the so-called maybe uniting for peace route. No, I think in this situation, I don't think that will work. Let me be frank with you. We need a clear understanding of all of this at the level of the Security Council, and only then an effective peace support operation could be mounted here. And the role of the Secretary General is indeed important. If there would, what we suggest in our report is that at day one, already at that zero phase I was talking about, there should be such a resolution calling for a comprehensive implementation of the Minsk agreements, and then also phased and sequenced. The Secretariat and Secretary General and his representative, then nominated, should be playing a very important role in actually developing that.
Yeah, I mean, briefly, I have to say I think the chances of progress before the elections are now pretty low, and I think that, sadly, is a diplomatic consensus in New York as well. Look, the Security Council is a mess right now, and it's a mess because of Syria, because of Yemen, because of many different issues. I don't think that you can advance this process through New York very easily. And I mean, our impression, and I sit in New York, is that actually the Russian mission to the UN is not very well plugged in to Moscow's thinking about these issues. And the one Security Council discussion of a peacekeeping force, which took place in 2017, was notable for its lack of focus and the Russian mission's apparent lack of preparation. What I suggested in my report, and I stand by, is that the planning for this mission, if it ever happens, needs to take place away from New York. I would suggest a Normandy Plus format, which would be the Normandy countries, the US, and some potential troop contributors, such as Sweden, leading on the planning, with the UN Secretary General as part of this, this sort of special planning group. And then once you have a political deal and once you have a plan, you take that to the Security Council, everyone claps, it's a lovely moment, but the hard work takes place somewhere else.
Дякую. Ну, по-перше, по Генеральній асамблеї і Раді безпеки, звичайно, що і
Certainly, both the General Assembly and the Secretary General have their roles, and that role would be to send the feasibility mission first. That would make an assessment, a feasibility study, so to say, before any decision is started to be discussed in the United Nations. But then again comes the turn of the Security Council's decision, and here we know that the position of the Russian Federation could be a major stumbling block, and we can hope that some other members of the Security Council, like Germany, the United States, being present in the Security Council, we can count on them, and in them providing, so to say, the foundation for the mandate of a peacekeeping mission. As far as the possibility of progress is concerned before the election campaign starts in Ukraine, I can mention here the fact that the Russian Federation has put a brake on these discussions within the Minsk negotiating process, and they might hope that the elections could add to the chaotic situation in Ukraine, and that they would be able to strengthen the positions of political forces friendly to the Russian Federation. So it is difficult as of today to say how and what progress could be achieved before the election campaign starts. And whether we speak about the peacekeeping mission or the withdrawal of the Russian personnel, it's going to be difficult because, as you know, Russian Federation is reluctant even to accept or to acknowledge the fact that their military personnel are among the pro-Russian militias in these self-proclaimed republics. Therefore, you need to take into account all these factors that I have mentioned when you assess the possibilities of progress in peaceful settlement in the Donbas. I was an ambassador of Ukraine to Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina in 2010 and for a few years, and I am now an advisor to the Minister of the occupied territories. My advice is to review the Croatian peaceful settlement should be taken or might be taken as a basis for the possible peaceful settlement in Ukraine. Having reviewed dozens of scenarios and plans that had never brought about peaceful settlements in many conflicts, we have come to the conclusion that the Minsk agreements should have their implementation mechanism. And one part of such mechanism could be an international peacekeeping mission, but in the form of the interim administration, local administration. In Croatia, it didn't bring any result. The peacekeepers were deployed, they took their positions. They might have prevented maybe some clashes and even some fatalities. But in terms of the return of the territories, nothing was reached. And Kosovo's experience with its very muddled constitutional process, I think it's not useful to us, but the interim administration, or transitional administration, I would rather call it, can be interesting, and that is a part of a Croatian settlement experience. There were a few thousand military personnel, a few thousand policemen, and they could be a similar deployment could be used in Ukraine, that the conflicting sides are taken apart, and then the control of the Ukraine of the border, its former border, the section of its former border with the Russian Federation should be renewed, and then what is needed is we need to disband the volunteers, paramilitary militias of the Lugansk and Donetsk republics. Then the heavy armaments should be taken under control, and as soon as the heavy armaments are surrendered, all the transitional administration starts functioning. What was your question? Well, it's rather my observation that my wish that the Russian veto in the Security Council, that the other countries that would be willing to support Ukraine, if if they put this vision into a draft of a resolution, Russia would not be able not to sign it because Russia is one of the signatories to the Minsk agreements. I have 3 questions. Please introduce yourself. I am from Primy TV channel. If these uncontrolled territories, if the elections take place there, and a lot of experts say that the Minsk format is not feasible, maybe well, our today's discussion is focused on peacekeeping mission, possible peacekeeping mission. Well, but my last question is, what's the Turkey's influence on the peacekeeping mission? Can Turkey's influence somehow accelerate the formation of this mission and President Erdogan's personal influence? Well, let me start with Minsk format. You referred to a possibility of altering the Minsk format. Well, first of all, it's a format that allowed the consensus between or among the participants of that process. As of today, there are 3 participants, and if we are going to make any alterations, any changes, then the consensus, the agreement of the Russian Federation would be needed, which it would probably not give. And we know that the sanctions are in place among the Russian Federation. They are serious business, and they impede the development of Russian economy. Russia loses, and loses a lot, and it is, as of today, is the most effective instrument of containing Russian aggression. If we leave the Minsk process that you asked about, if we abandon it altogether, we will not be able to influence the sanctions option. So my idea is that we should not abandon this process. And if we turn to the Budapest memorandum that you mentioned, yes, I'm of the opinion that that memorandum included one of the countries that practically abandoned its commitments. And we need to continue working with the other countries that signed that memorandum and that are part to the Minsk process, and France, Germany, possibly with China. And we certainly are aware of the consequences of the memorandum, Budapest memorandum. I think it badly affected the vision and the attitudes of the countries with regard to nuclear weapons, because many of them started viewing the real atomic weapons, nuclear weapons, as a real guarantee rather than a piece of paper that can be abandoned by any party that had signed that or signed that paper.
It's very important for Ukraine to realize, if you would be the party giving up Minsk, that could also have repercussions for other things which are very important for this country, including the sanctions, which are even not that firm. There is a clear agreement in the European Union, we refer to it also in the report, that sanctions, Donbas-related sanctions, should also only be lifted after the full implementation of Minsk. So that's important for you. So if you then start to make moves to walk away from Minsk, even if I agree and understand with your difficulties with Minsk, and that's also precisely why we have been devoting some attention to the Minsk agreements, and I agree with you that they need to be revisited in terms of what we propose in the report. only a sequenced and phased scenario can ever help for the parties to implement fully Minsk. So if that is what you have against Minsk, then I agree with you. But don't do away with it. That would, I think, be a fatal mistake.
How about the question of introducing, gentleman over first, asked introducing reference to the Minsk agreements in the resolution? Is it the question you asked? No? It was okay. So from his perspective, this is a must-do, basically. What do you think about this?
Well, look, the Security Council endorsed Minsk II. It is there in the Security Council resolution, and there is pretty much no way the Security Council can pass any further resolution on Ukraine without referring to that precedent. So Minsk II, at least, will be referred to as part of the legal basis for any mission going forward. I fully endorse your point about Eastern Slavonia as a model. The reason I ended up working on this issue is, in fact, that I had written a history of the Eastern Slavonia Peacekeeping Mission. And so, just occasionally people read academic articles, and that was how I got into this business. There was a question on Turkey as a potential contributor. I think that's an interesting question. As I said in my opening remarks, I do think that to sustain a significant peace operation in Donbas, you would need some NATO countries that are acceptable to Russia. Now, Russian-Turkish relations are obviously quite volatile, but nonetheless, I can imagine a situation in which a Turkish contingent could be part of a UN mission.
Thank you. We take the last round of questions, I think, and please raise your hands who has questions to ask and comments. If there is nobody else, we give the second chance to gentlemen to ask again. Is there Valery? Jan. So, okay, short question then, and then we have Valery Kravchenko. And yeah.
Безумовно, всі ініціативи щодо миротворчих місій.
Do you think that all the scenarios of peacekeepers deployment include the interim administration? I think it's interesting, but I recall two instances when interim administrations were introduced. These were Kosovo and Eastern Timor. Both of these instances led to the formation of independent countries. And if we look either at Kosovo or Eastern Timor, we could say that these are the main instances of similar experiences with interim administrations. It's not, the list is not exhausted by these two countries, but still, who could say that this interim administration would not lead to a full separation, a total separation of Donbas from Ukraine? In these interim administrations, the big question is whether there would be sufficient presence of Ukrainian representatives, and who says that these interim administrations would bring about the reintegration of these territories back into Ukraine. If a mission with such an administration is introduced there, wouldn't we ourselves have the calamity of our own making?
So, too many if we need to implement this scenario of peacekeeping operation in Donbas. But if we are talking about the futurology, a very concrete question to you. You mentioned about the pre-deployment, about the zero phase, and as usual, for zero phase, for pre-deployment, it is a practice to establishing of peacekeeping hubs and training centers in the neighbor countries. For example, if you're talking about the Sudan, about the UNMIS, such center allocated in Ethiopia. So we understand clearly that if pre-deployment will be here in Ukraine, this hub will be created here, there will be a lot of speculations about the peacekeepers, from Belarus or from Kazakhstan. It will be highly speculated issue here in Ukraine. And if we create such hub somewhere in Belarus, for example, because it's originally understandable because the Minsk process is allocated in Belarus, or in Latvia, or in Turkey, or in Moldova even, so it will be another understanding of that issue because it will be also speculated about from the other hand. So what is your vision on this issue? What is your understanding of this pre-deployment phase? Thank you.
Thank you. So who'd like to start?
Maybe a couple of words just.
Yeah, maybe.
I do not share such a pessimistic approach that interim civil administration will lead to creation of independent state. Kosovo and situation in Donbas are two different situations, and we cannot compare them. Yes, it seems to me we need this administration because it will be quite difficult to reach agreement with Russia that Ukrainian, let's say, I don't know, administration or armed forces immediately will enter into occupied today's areas when Russia leaves this area. So some interim period we need, and United Nations interim civil administration, I think that a good response to that issue and to that demand. Thank you.
Yeah, concerning that question, yes, there are, of course, these examples which we do not wish to see happen in your situation. So very much always depends on the mandate. What kind of mandate? And again, read our report. An interim civilian administration, also partly for the reasons you mentioned. We don't suggest a full foreign administration of the Donbas area. We feel that it is important that Ukraine starts to commit itself in that broad phase situation from the beginning. For instance, also the organization of the elections, of course, should be done in close consultation with the SEC, the Central Electoral Committee. So what should happen in that phase, where, for reasons already explained by Ambassador Motzik, you need also a third party to make it happen. But of course, the objective is the full control of Ukraine after the elections over these areas, including then also to the border. So it is indeed a different situation. And although I understand a bit your worry, again, a lot is what I have learned also as a practitioner in crisis management. A lot is also important in terms of the detail of the mandate, what such an interim civilian administration is called upon to do. And of course, it should not lead to the Kosovo or East Timor outcomes in this case. And then the other question on the zero phase and the pre-deployment, and if I got your question right, whether it was a good idea to pre-deploy in Ukraine, I don't fully understand why that would be a problem. After all, the OSCE is also fully pre-deployed and deployed throughout Ukraine. I cannot envisage a mission where a UN force would not also be able to pre-deploy in Ukraine. And I would not actually venture into other places. There's sometimes other issues, you know, when you have a force, you have to, but that's absolutely up to the force itself, how and from where it gets its whatever it needs. And there may be other lines of communication which do not have to go necessarily through Ukraine. But I think it is an important principle that Ukraine, as the host country, which is also having to approve the mission, is then also the place where pre-deployment would take place.
Yeah, on the peacekeeping hub issue, it seems to me that it is natural that you would have peacekeepers pre-deployed in Ukrainian-controlled territory. I think that countries that are unable to deploy personnel into Donbas might be able to assist with the logistics. Germany, France, etc., could provide airlift. No, it seems entirely logical that the operational headquarters would be in Ukrainian-controlled territory near the Donbas until the force actually deployed. Now look, on this transitional administration issue, the UN has run 4 transitional administrations. One was a very long time ago in Papua New Guinea, and then there's Kosovo, Timor, and then there's Eastern Slavonia. And in the Eastern Slavonian case, the UN deployed for 2 years to reintegrate rebel territory into Croatia. And it worked. For the first year, it was fully administered by the UN. For the second year, it was a cooperation between the UN and Croatian authorities. It was a phased transition of responsibility back to Croatia. Then the UN left. The OSCE stayed for a while, mainly doing police work. But it was a fairly rapid reintegration. So we actually do have a good model, which is why the ambassador referred to it, of a UN transitional administration that was quick, that was effective in security terms. It did deter spoilers, and it resulted in the reintegration of territory. So I wouldn't worry, but I do think you have a point, which is whenever there are peacekeepers on the ground, there are always forces to extend their presence. And if I were the Russians, maybe after a year or two I would think again, and I would start sort of creating security incidents in Donbas to make the argument that the peacekeepers needed to stay longer. And that's something I wrote about in my report, a stay-behind Russian presence that we have to be sure is not there. So there is a risk that the peacekeeping would last longer than necessary, but here you have one really good friend, and that's John Bolton. The current US administration does not like big, long-running peacekeeping operations. It wants peacekeeping to be short and cheap. And I can assure you that this US administration will not back a mission that they think will last indefinitely.
Thank you. Thank you indeed for this discussion. I think this was a good refresh ahead of another discussion is going to take place soon. Let me thank the IRF for bringing Mr. Serry here. Let me thank German Marshall Fund for bringing Mr. Gowan here. Let me thank Ukraine for bringing Mr. Mozak here. And for Europe Center for organizing this event, surely. And thank you for your participation. And please join me in saying thank you to the speakers today.